Saturday Night People Part 1, production number 22663, data recording 24/11/78, take 1.
Thank you. Hello and welcome to Saturday Night People. We're joined again tonight by Peter Mackay, and if two visits constitute regularity of any sort or any nature, then we're as regular a team as you'll get in a day's march. Welcome to you, Peter Mackay. Our usual team, of course, is Clive James sitting at that far end and Janet Street Porter in the middle. What I've been doing since I saw you last is going to Belfast, nipping over to Belfast to try surreptitiously to open a few betting shops before anybody else got there, but a lot of them were closed or open when I got there. I had a smashing weekend, quite booze-sodden and delightful. They're delightful people, they looked after me, they talked about nothing else but the troubles. I came back very refreshed. What has obsessed you in your waking hours, Clive?
I'm bound to say I've been a bit depressed all week about the imminent closure of the Sunday Times. Did you see that Panorama project on the subject?
No.
It was quite staggering because you felt that the management and the workers aren't talking the same language at all. The people in the penthouse and the people in the pit literally can't understand each other. Because the guys upstairs talk something like, the dividend goes out there, it should reappear, yeah, yeah. And then when you get down to the pit, everything the guys are saying sounds like a solo by Johnny Rotten. And the divorce between the way they talk is staggering. I speak as an outsider, but I can't believe it's a regional difference. It's a class difference. And I really think England should be rid of it. And the only man in the whole place who can speak a language everyone can understand seems to be the editor, Harry Evans. And I'm just sorry to see the Sunday Times in trouble, because like every contributor to The Observer, such as yourself,
thank you,
I like to feel that I'm writing for a paper that, and there's no point writing for The Observer unless the Sunday Times is there to be better than, if you get me.
I get the point, yes. Okay, John.
Right, well, that's job spot over. I'll tell you something that happened to me this week. Well, it happened about 2 weeks ago. You know how you see people in car parks who you vaguely know while you're parking the car, a little bit of chit-chat. Down the road opposite the National Theatre, I'm parking the car and I see the editor of Ritz magazine, known as Pitts magazine to those in the know. And I paused to talk to him because I could see piles of unsold copies of Ritz in the back of his car. Anyway, we had a bit of chit-chat, and you know, I've learnt now never to speak to anyone like that because I always put my foot in it, because in the latest issue it says, Janet Street Porter says the strangest things for the intelligent lady we all know her to be. That's ironic. First, her remark that she is getting rid of her 3.4 Mark II Jaguar because it looks like a tart's car, but will replace it with a pickup truck. Done it again.
You walked into that, you walked
Yes.
into that. Peter, what has been obsessing you?
I've been obsessed by newspapers too, particularly the very restrained reporting of the events at Minehead and all the ramifications of that case.
It's occupied your waking hours?
It has occupied most of my waking hours, in fact, yes.
Have you been down to Minehead?
I haven't been down to Minehead, no.
And do you intend to go?
Yes, I think I'm going to try to get there by the weekend.
Well, let me try and probably save you a journey, because Minehead will not, have, as he points out, have escaped anybody's attention this week. Clive James has even been down there, and if you've not yet been mentioned tonight, could be your very big night, Minehead Revisited.
Normally at this time of the year, nothing much happens in the beautiful British seaside resort of Minehead. Somewhere out beyond the headlands, a gull breaks wind. But this week, Minehead hit the news as one of the locations for what may well prove to be the biggest British movie ever made. The movie is called The Dog It Was That Died. It stars practically everybody. You couldn't move for blimp cameras, rifle mics, sun guns and hip flasks. A microwave dish was set up so that the planet Mars could get the news. Mainly the vivid images being transmitted were of media men bumping into each other. Nobody knew at this point that the reporting restrictions would be lifted. Local citizens were in demand for interviews, especially since the media men outnumbered them 10 to 1. This man won instant fame for being the first in the queue. After being interviewed a couple of hundred times, he'd got his answer down to a fine art.
Do you normally queue for things like this? Don't for exposure. I've never seen queues.
This car contained someone who was actually in the trial. Those cameramen who still had some film left over from photographing each other got the shot.
I haven't got his wife there.
No, I haven't. But Bob did, I think. That'd be the better picture out of the two, I suppose.
One film crew and about 6 cameramen.
The man doing the listening is gossip writer Paul Callan. Judging from those scratches on his plump cheek, he's been either mugged or made love to, or perhaps both. Auberon Waugh, he's the one on the far right as usual, is all set to write a book about the forthcoming trial. Doubtless it will be as sober as everything else he has written, or perhaps even less. At first it appeared that Lord Longford had turned up disguised as a woman. Then it became clear that a woman had turned up disguised as Lord Longford.
Actually, to see how few people there are, I think, don't you?
Yes.
Well, I expected more of a mob.
Yes. Why has it not aroused a lot of interest in the town, this case?
Well, this is a very strange town, and we're apt to mind our own business, rather, and things that concern the outer world, we are apt to sort of say, well, let them get on with it, we're busy with our lot. True?
Yeah, true. Yeah, well, I enjoyed it more when he came here for the day, you know, when he was charged before. That was quite nice. It was just sort of a short day, and, you know, it was much more nicer than I thought it was. It was, I suppose this is hanging about much more today. There was nothing doing this morning, there's nothing this afternoon as yet.
I'll give you some level now. Nightclub owner George...
The BBC sent its usual 243,986 representatives, of whom this is one.
Running. Now, this is Michael Cole, BBC Television News, with track commentary which goes ahead almost immediately. The queue for the 20 places in the public gallery was already forming 2.5 hours before the committal was due to begin.
By this time, everyone was numb with shock at the realization that the restrictions were lifted and they would have to do 3 weeks' hard work of real reporting, instead of the cushy number known in the trade as mood assessment. Evening comes to Minehead. The first day's shooting winds to an end. Every bar in town is jammed to the hammered beams with media men. The streets are deserted. Withdrawing down a ramp of pebbles, the tide makes a long sucking noise, like a sigh of regret.
And now, when Peter Mackay saw that film for the first time this afternoon, he was greatly exercised by the injuries done to Paul Callan.
Yes, I'm able to reveal the cause of these Mau Mau-style scars.
Down his cheek?
Yes, he in fact was mugged by 2 young black men on the Fulham Road who had, I think, taken exception to some of his effusions in the Daily Mirror. And the story in Fleet Street is that he's a liberal, Callan, you see, and works at the Daily Mirror, and isn't really very against mugging, so he was lying in the gutter and they'd taken his wallet and they were running up the road and he cried after them, "I still have sympathy for the plight of your people."
Did they turn around and say thank you?
Yes, they did, yes. And they gave him back his Harrods credit card.
And then they mugged him again.
They mugged him again.
What, do you have animadversions upon that film?
I only to reiterate that I think it's probably Longford's greatest coup. It's his most stunning move to date in the entertainment world, and he must have his own show. Lord Longford's big night, right?
Yeah. The disguise wasn't all that good,
Impersonations, prison visits,
right.
Everything.
It's a lot. We bring you memories from out of the sky, my partner and I. Now, in the last 12 weeks, we have not actually looked at something called gymnastics. Now, gymnastics is a kind of combination of beauty and danger. And who more apposite to present a little item combining beauty and danger than Janet Street Porter?
Not quite sure which way to take that, but I will proceed. Gymnastics is a sport which allows middle-aged chaps to sit at home and thrill to the sight of underage teenies contorting away in skin-tight leotards. It's the fastest-growing sport in this country. About 3.25 million people do it every school day, and all the top clubs have waiting lists for years to come. The boom in gymnastics started with Olga Korbut in July 1972. Then only 500,000 people were gymnasts. 6 months later the figure had doubled, and it goes up every time the sport is shown on television. But it has another aspect, and one which deserves a closer look. At the World Championships in Strasbourg last month, there were a handful of incidents which show just how dangerous gymnastics is becoming. In their bid for medals, people are attempting more and more difficult routines, often at great risk to the body should they make the slightest slip. These routines are worked out in gyms with foam-lined pits and safety nets, none of which are supplied in international competition.
Standard of competition. Oh, he's missed it.
Well, this is one aspect that frightens me very much. I'm sure you all saw Filatova out in Strasbourg, where she landed on her head or neck from the beam. And this is a very, not a very good image for us in gymnastics. But the philosophy of the international governing body and the judges in the sport say that, well, a gymnast shouldn't be attempting these movements in competition if they're not ready. Which is quite true, I suppose, but on the other hand, they are human beings that we're asking to perform these movements, and we like to have someone to work with the following day.
Did Bill think that the Eastern European countries who dominate the sport would go along with better safety precautions?
But there's no doubt about it that the East European countries are highly competitive and highly motivated to be competitive in this nature. But and in the strive to get one over the other fella, then they are trying much more and more dangerous tricks. Skills is probably a better word than tricks. And it's frightening for people like ourselves, because we sit back and say, well, if we're going to try and win a medal in the 1980 Olympic Games or the 1984 Olympic Games, then we've got to start being a little bit inventive ourselves. And the type of things that we're going to have to invent are really frightening. Thank God in this country, the most serious kind of injuries that we have are broken legs, a dislocated elbow. We've never really had a very serious injury, but I've heard that in some of the Eastern European countries of broken necks and people being paralysed.
Another sinister aspect of the sport at international level is that the Eastern European countries are said to administer drugs to their most promising girl gymnasts in order to offset puberty. When they've won their medals, the little girls are allowed to grow up. And of course, adolescence means heavier bodies and less supple limbs and an end to prizes. But it's hard to prove that the drugs are given to the girls because they're given to them back home and not during competitions. Bill McLaughlin finds the little girl image of the sport depressing.
Personally, I think it's, in a way, it's a tragedy, because I like to think that women's gymnastics is for women and not little girls kind of thing, that all very well little girls can compete, but at their own level of competition, in junior competition, and that senior competition should be for senior women gymnasts.
There's a message of bright hope in that you just delivered, Janet. You said, and I may quote you if I may, of course adolescence means heavier bodies, less supple limbs and an end to winning prizes. Guess what I am? Adolescent again. I've lost all those things. What about Nadia is she called Comaneci? We saw her,
I think, with the final IMS.
She has blossomed into a quite
She's
beautiful...
turned into a very lovely girl, and as Alan Weeks and other commentators never tired of telling us, this was a kind of tragedy, because she could no longer
do the tricks she could earlier. In fact, she could do them, she just didn't look quite as good doing them. See, there's a good reason for trying to keep the girls young, is that the prepubescent girls have no mass and therefore no momentum. So they can do these fantastic things and not get killed. Yeah. I mean, that dismount Falatova does off the beam, it's a 2.5 backwards Sukahara with a toe in each ear or something. She landed right on her head, and if she'd been a big girl, she would have been dead meat. And you see what happened to Rhonda Schwant of the United States?
Who?
Rhonda Schwant of the United States, on the beam. Rhonda Schwant.
That's a name.
She did a backflip and she landed with one leg on each side of the beam. It made a noise like a peach hitting a brick wall. She got up smiling.
Well, on the outside, smiling on the outside, but laughing on the inside.
I don't know why. It reminds me of the story, the report I had last night of the Irish attempt on Everest, which was just failed. The scaffolding collapsed.
I mean, Janet, do you have a contribution?
Only just to say that I do feel that gymnastics is a sport about which more male commentators have spoken and written more drivel put end to end than possibly any other sport. It's always little girls, this kind of fantasy thing. In fact, it's ruthless, it's tough, and at the top,
if it contains
dangerous.
the seeds of fantasy, you must not deny these people that kind of fantasising.
But it's not drivel, it's drool. I mean, there is a sexual element, no question of it.
It's also, you know, what it does point out is that you know those things that they were landing on, what are they called? Mats and mattresses, yeah, and trampoline type things. It's not the only dangerous thing. There's a wonderful story told about Dame Eva Turner when she was singing Tosca. She was rather a big lady, and at the end, as you know, Tosca hurls herself off a balcony and to kill herself, and she delivered her final aria, and she threw herself off a balcony over the back of the stage, and they'd built a rather too sort of sophisticated equipment for her to fall on, and as she disappeared, she suddenly then bounced back up in full speed. And the audience stopped laughing and carried on crying. Now, we move from opera and from gymnastics to newspapers, back to newspapers again. We seem to be on newspapers a lot of the time. I'm now fulfilling the role almost of Daniel in the Lion's Den, because I'm going to talk about the Daily Star briefly, and the London editor of the Daily Star is sitting on my left-hand side, and normally in this type of programme we can slag people off without their immediate replies. Anyway, here goes. The Daily Star has a reputation for the best pictures in the business, and it must be true because the Daily Star says so. Just look at these star pictures published on November 8th. Milk float. Milkman Mike King is on the crest of a wave, says the Star. He takes the plunge with the pinters to deliver to St Mary's Lighthouse in a wetsuit and a schnorkel. A likely story, we thought. So we phoned Milkman Mike King at his home in North Shields. Did he really deliver milk to the lighthouse? Well, I used to many years ago, but we used to leave the milk on the causeway. We didn't take it across. Oh, you mean you don't go there at all now? Well, not now, not since my dad was alive 19 years ago. So the whole thing was a stunt. Yes, they got in touch with me and we thought it would be a good idea. Was it a good idea?
I think this is a very strange business. The lighthouse is genuine.
Is it?
There's no question there. There is a lighthouse.
Is there a causeway?
I saw something in Campaign magazine. Best answer is this, I think.
Yeah, tell us about your circulation, please. I mean,
you haven't answered my question. You're flaunting these knockers about.
Quite about
the question.
I think this is a very serious accusation for this man to make.
Which man? Me?
This milkman.
Come on,
if it
give us a
encourages young children to drink more milk, I think it's fair enough. That effect.
What about your circulation? I mean, there was something about your circulation.
He's sweating, can't you see? Circulation is perfectly good.
Circulation is perfectly all right, Mr. James.
Do you mean the circulation of the newspaper or your blood pressure at this moment?
Considerably in excess of the observable circulation.
While you're here,
it's been in existence for 180 years while we've been out in the streets for 2 weeks.
I must say something that...
Out on the streets isn't the phrase I'd use in connection with your... I just couldn't say, can I give... Now that you're here, let me offer you a piece of advice. Let me tell you, I see it this way. That you're essentially fighting a page 3 war against other papers where page 3 is the emphasis.
We're on page 7.
Yeah, your page 3 is on page 7, but it's the same thing, you know. And what you need is a girl with 4 knockers.
Yes.
You've got to raise the stakes. You've got to have the kind of girl...
It's difficult to find, Mr. James. It may seem a very simple matter to you to find a girl with 4
breasts. You can tell if you get slightly needled by this. They start using the word Mr. James instead of Clive or anything.
Yes.
Let me be serious for a brief...
talk of nipples.
No, knockers.
We haven't mentioned it. Can I just ask you? May I just ask you? Forgive me for...
Absolutely.
Have other newspapers significantly altered their nipple presentation to accommodate you?
Yes, there are more erect nipples. In the Daily Mirror. The Daily Mirror have been throwing pictures of iced water over the models to achieve an effect.
You've made him laugh.
Yeah.
I think this is really appalling, this conversation.
All right.
It's boring.
I get this picture of the photographer throwing the ice water and then putting down the bucket and picking up the camera before the effect dies away. That's why he has to do it again, you know.
Just before Janet's face.
I wanted to tell you that I've been spending a lot of time in Yorkshire, and I noticed your paper's only sold outside London, so I've been able to see what newspapers people really do like up north.
Yes.
And where I've been, they like news like the local pigeon fanciers meet, and front page news is the Cubs raise lots of money in the charity walks, and there aren't any nipples in the local
He's trying
papers.
to raise their expectations.
But all the newspapers end up at the bottom of birds' cages anyway, particularly in the north.
Some of them just end up there sooner, that's all.
Yes.
Or bottom drawers.
Yes, the Observer has a pretty fine texture for the bottom of budgie cages, or cockatoo cages.
Four boobs, that's what you want. So the copy can run, look men, 38, 38, 24, 38.
I think you've made all 4 points quite significantly, Clive. It's time we took a break. Back in 2 minutes. Stay tuned. See you then.
Saturday Night People Part 2, production number 22663, data recording 24/11/78, take 1.
Welcome back. On Thursday, a lot of us had to fiddle rather excessively with our knobs to try and find news of fresh disasters. Clive James was amongst us. Clive.
If you can't find Radio 3 in its old position on the dial, and that, of course, was 69 kilograms, 48 hertz rent-a-cars on the medium band, you can easily find its new position. Try 472.067 recurring centipedes, 1,066 megaphones, and ask for room service. There's nothing to it. Right in amongst the distress signals from sinking Greek oil tankers, you'll hear fragments of all your favourite Radio 3 programmes. Not only will a show like Critics Foreskin sound almost as clear as it did before, but you'll have all the fun of trying to find it before it's over. And the same applies to radios 1, 2 and 4. What could be simpler? Or to put it another way, what could be more complicated, ridiculous and annoying? How did the Beeb manage to get its wavelengths mucked about by a country as small and nasty as Albania? The finger of suspicion points at a mixed civil service and BBC team which attended a wavelength conference in Geneva 3 years ago. Team leader was a senior civil servant, Jolyon Dromgoole. Night People researchers are now in a position to reveal that Mr. Dromgoole himself has recently been obliged to change wavelengths. No longer does he have the responsibility of protecting our airwaves. Instead, he has the responsibility of protecting the entire country. His new appointment is to the Ministry of Defence. Meanwhile, the Beeb has set up a special office to answer the 1,200 inquiries an hour they are getting from demented pensioners who tune into Gardener's Question Time and get Rio de Janeiro radio taxis. Most frequent question asked is, what happened to the World Service? The answer is that it has moved to Radio 3's old spot, which was given away to the small and nasty Albanians. But the Albanians haven't yet built a transmitter to fit it. The Albanians' original intention, apparently, was to fill the air with pro-Chinese propaganda, but lately they are not quite so fond of the Chinese. If you want to hear some Chinese propaganda, incidentally, just tune into Desert Island Discs, and you'll hear a French-language broadcast from Radio Peking attacking the Gang of Four. That's the Gang of Four on the old Radio 3, just between the new radios 2 and 1, VHF, 12,000 RPM, 150 MPH, DSO, DFC, POQ, BUM.
What I feel quite sorry about is the fact that our local commercial radio stations, like Capital Radio and LBC, if I may apologise for using that word, are actually spending quite significant amounts of money advertising the fact that they are staying exactly where they are. which is a grotesque situation to be forced into if you're...
It's almost been worth it for the comedy of the BBC trying to explain the whole thing as the triumph. You didn't see Aubrey Singer on Nationwide last night, did you?
No.
Aubrey was sitting there and he was answering, it was a phone-in, right? And the way the BBC was telling it, the whole thing was an unmitigated, an unparalleled triumph, and people were writing in to congratulate them. You see, ringing up to congratulate them. And a professor of microwave technology or something who owned 3 radios rang up to complain, saying he couldn't get Radio 4 on any of them. And Aubrey said it was no problem. All he had to do, get that, all he had to do, was buy something called an adapter, which would cost him only, get that, only £6.
And you can use it all at once, or do you have to plug it into 3 separate
By the time you get it all linked up, of course, the day's over.
Down. Right.
I've done a couple of programmes about pirate radio stations. It always takes you into very deep water with a Home Office, and you always have to put in, at their request, loads and loads of extremely boring data about wavelength allocations, and of course it's really difficult to remember all this. And one of my things involved a boat trip to find Radio Caroline, which seemed a good idea at the time. Anyway, we set out from Ramsgate Harbour. It pissed with rain. We went in this force 7 gale. We couldn't find Radio Caroline. I'm in this fishing boat, and I'm supposed to be spouting all this crap about the Strasbourg Convention and the allocation of radio waves. And I have a very bad memory, so my producer very kindly wrote it on a roll of Sanderson's lining paper, very Sanderson's, very Janet Street Porter, and he's unrolling it like this, and I'm sitting in the prow of the boat, being sick the wrong way, you know, into the wind, and looking up, desperately trying to speak this Home Office drivel, and suddenly there was a great gust of wind, and it blew it away into the North Sea. It was terrible. We all broke down and cried. It was terrible. Don't speak to me about wavelengths.
Britannia wasn't ruling your wavelengths that night. Anyway, there's more. I'm sorry, that's made me weep a bit. There is more trouble also for BBC of a different kind of nature and a private nature, but there is actually evidence of this trouble on a kind of tape, and Peter Mackay has got even deeper evidence of it. Peter.
Those of you who have listened to wireless reports from Parliament will now know what an amazingly rowdy bunch of men represent us there. They shriek, howl, stamp their feet, moan, whine, and generally make a Ford Strikers meeting sound like a memorial service by comparison. However, the men from the BBC and Independent Radio who report these disturbing affairs couldn't be nicer. They never stamp their feet and rarely shout. Sadly, this is a situation which may not last. The glass-fronted House of Lords box from which they operate on special occasions like the state opening of Parliament, a coffin-shaped arrangement into which they have to climb, is described as like lowering yourself into the cockpit of a Spitfire. But instead of this cockpit being occupied by one of the few, on one recent dramatic occasion it was occupied by one too many. Radio 4's Brian Cottoys and IRN's Ed Boyle had been lowered into position when, through the entry hatch, climbed one Peter Jones of BBC Television. There was as heated an altercation as is possible in such circumstances before Jones finally wedged himself on the floor between the other two perspiring Elver Liddells. And off they went to a cacophony of cliches. Due to the close proximity of BBC and IRN equipment, IRN listeners were then placed in the happy and perhaps novel position of hearing both broadcasts simultaneously.
Black Rod, of course, the man who's now on his way back with the members of the House of Commons to hear Her Majesty's speech. The sword of state on the right of Her Majesty is carried by Field Marshal, the Lord Carver. On the left of him, on the other side of Her Majesty, Lord Peart, who is the leader of the House of Lords, again in his ceremonial ermine and robes, is carrying the traditional cap of maintenance.
Naturally, this has now been the subject of indignant letters between IRN and BBC hierarchy, and a sinister-sounding parliamentary figure, the Black Rod, is also involved in the row. So if the men from the black hole of broadcasting run amok again, they can expect a sharp knocking on their hatch by a man wearing very strange clothes indeed, carrying a big stick, who will cry, "Is there a stranger in the box?"
I thought the radio set took its part very well for 37 seconds. I've never seen a shot held so long as what we just saw.
Very nice wireless, too.
Very lovely
yes,
wireless.
yes.
Lovely, very good reproduction.
Yes, yes.
You think so?
Yes.
You've been stuck in boxes, haven't you, reporting things?
Only once have I ever been asked to commentate on a state occasion, and this was when I was at London Broadcasting station that brings you the news first. And it was Princess Anne's wedding. Now, unfortunately, there wasn't a seat for me in Westminster Abbey. I don't know why. I didn't get there. A lot of other people got there, I never got there. I was stuck in LBC, underground, in a basement studio, with a television set that they put there, and colour TV, and I had to do a commentary as if I was there in Westminster Abbey, you know. From my seat, I see the Duchess of Kent's wearing this and wearing that, exactly as if I was watching the wedding. In fact, I was watching TV with the sound turned down, I might add.
Did you do it brilliantly?
Well as you can do on one of those cheap rented sets, you know.
Without doing that kind of thing, brilliant. No,
precisely. Do you have aspirations for reporting things like Parliament, Clive?
Absolutely not, because you've got to realise in Australia, the land of my birth, there has always been broadcasting of Parliament. It's no new thing. And the reason why because you can always turn it on any day and hear what they're at, that is the reason why the average Australian has a very low opinion of politicians. Because you wouldn't believe what the Australian Parliament sounds like. To be a commentator, you've got to be a wrestling commentator to cover it. You can hear stuff like, I submit the honourable member for Dandenong is a cockatoo. And on the other side of the house you hear a distant voice, would the honourable member for Murrumbidgee care to come out here and say that? Oh, you mug, you galah. And then the commentator comes in. The members for Murrumbidgee and Dandenong are arguing about the agricultural appropriation. You boof, bang, well, that goes on. That sort of thing actually happens. It is unbelievable.
Do you think, Peter, that our Parliament has changed its tune to accommodate itself to broadcasting? I mean, are people more civil and more well-behaved?
I think they're even less civil. I think they're less civil. I think they make as much noise as they possibly can, and they hope that their relatives, mothers and so on, will hear them.
Or their constituents, even.
Oh, they're even their constituents.
It may be the first time their constituents have heard them.
But I was interested about this, with Clive and talking about Australian politicians. The only Australian politicians I'd ever heard of were Gough and Margaret Whitlam. Well, I heard the story the other day about how it was. I'd always been amazed by she always travelled on planes with Gough. He never goes anywhere on planes without her, and it was explained to me the other day that this is because she was the only woman in Australia capable of kick-starting a 747.
But didn't you cover Derby Day once as a reporter?
Yes, when I was doing Hickey on the Daily Express, there was a terrible fight. We both had to phone our material over to London, and there was only one press phone, and one of my reporters, Christopher Wilson, got into a fight in full morning dress and so on with Nigel Dempster of the Daily Mail, and their hats were rolling all over the floor. I always remember the scene of John Oaksey of the Daily Telegraph standing on the table shouting, 6-4 on Dempster!
Right, well, from one fight to another different kind of fighting, what do you think a paint pot and a map and an axeman have in common? And if you don't know and you'll never guess, John at Street Porter will tell you.
London Transport under the Tory GLC is famous for its ruthless attitude to wasteful expense. Horace Cutler recently appointed Leslie Chapman, formerly a top civil servant, to the London Transport Board because of his record in pruning jobs. The axeman cometh, Mr. Chapman told the press. This attitude finds confirmation in the executive's line on interior decoration. Two computer operators at London Transport's Newman Street offices had become so tired of the dirty old messroom walls and London Transport's reluctance to repaint them that they did the job themselves in their own time with their own money. For this act of public endeavour, the pair were disciplined, demoted and received wage cuts of about £2,000 each. Unhappy at this, the two left London Transport, and their union has now taken up their case. This line on interior decoration doesn't seem to hold all round London Transport, however. In April, their Broadway offices were graced with a new deputy chief. He's management consultant John Stansby. He's a fellow director with GLC chief Horace Cutler of the Central Milton Keynes Shopping Management Company Limited. And as it was long overdue, his offices were redecorated. The job was lavish. In fact, one map alone, which now hangs on John Stansby's office wall, was specially made for him at a cost of several £100s. Will Mr. Stansby be taking a pay cut? Well, he will not. In fact, when he joined London Transport, instead of the going rate of nearly £17,000, he cost London Transport approximately £22,500 a year. Not, however, in his own name, because London Transport have not hired John Stansby. They've hired a firm called Dumont, Stansby and Company Limited, who in turn have hired John Stansby. He also retains various other directorships, which take up to 4 days of his time each month. Still, at least he hasn't had the cheek to paint his own office for nothing.
Now, It's now getting on for 20 years since the first issue of Private Eye went on sale, and to many people, what was once a thorn in the side of the British establishment has long since become a part of the journalistic scene. The magazine's harshest critics in the 70s have not been the Tory cabinet ministers and high church bishops who once denounced it, but fellow journalists, many of whom contributed to its pages before growing disillusioned with Lord Nome and his empire. They've been complaining recently not only about the content of the Eye, but also the behaviour of the small group of people who run it. The personnel hasn't changed much since Richard Ingram's, Willie Rushton, Christopher Booker and one or two others started the ball rolling in 1961. From the beginning, the staff has been a strange mixture of left-wing firebrands and cynical ex-public schoolboys. But today, the contrast seems more pronounced than ever.
There are a couple of people, though, of whom I think you could say that they're in it as radicals, and they like to poke the torch into the darker corners. There's less and less of that in the paper, and what there is of it is stuffed away at the back, where it's hardly ever read, and very badly written, it must be said. And then there's sort of just a collection of political eccentrics, really. Romantic right-wingers, I think you could say they were. I mean, two of their leading contributors are just in a terrible row at the moment for anti-Jewish remarks they've made in another paper. And that kind of mentality can be seen in the paper, too. Very often a Jewish name is considered a joke in itself. And really, that's not very funny. And nor is it very brave, or very hard-hitting, or very satirical.
Christopher Hitchens even doubts whether Private Eye any longer deserves its formerly secure reputation for accuracy.
I mean, I've often leaked them stuff and read it in Private Eye, and I think, Christ, you couldn't give these people a scoop at dictation speed. You know, they get the most extraordinary things wrong. And there's no checking and no follow-up. And repeated climb downs, and you get the impression that they don't really care whether the story's right or not, and that it's all just an in-group public school gag. You know? And it's got to the point where even when they print something that's true, people don't believe it. They don't read it in order to find anything out in the way that perhaps they used to. And you could say that Nome's law was that when you read about a subject you know about yourself in Private Eye, it's wrong.
It's also been said that Private Eye is an inconstant employer. More than one hapless contributor has found himself a welcome guest at the magazine's offices in Soho one day and persona non grata the next. In some cases, the unlucky outcast has even found himself slagged off in the next edition. A man called John Hatton was hurled into outer darkness a few years ago, having supplied the paper with regular columns over a 3-year period. He was one of the writers who compiled the In the Courts feature, masquerading under the name of Justinian for the Money.
For the first time, I'd managed to negotiate myself a regular income from the magazine. I was going to supply the In the Courts columns on a regular weekly basis and be paid not a fantastic fee for doing so, but a fee which at least would justify me going out and getting the things. And this was negotiated. I sent in the first 2 regular columns under the arrangement. Neither of them appeared. Obviously, one expects that to happen every now and then through space considerations. But a few weeks later I was down in London and thought that I would call in the office to find out what had happened to my efforts. The first thing I discovered was that Nome House now had an entry phone. And I'm not very technically minded, but eventually I managed to work out how this thing worked, announced myself, and was told, no, you can't come up. And that was the end of my connection with Private Eye.
As a former regional correspondent of the Eye, Hatton's main gripe about the way it has developed over the last few years is that important but unglamorous provincial stories have been squeezed out, while trivial anecdotes about London journalists and for London journalists have multiplied.
In fact, the magazine has developed into a magazine of trendy London journalists talking about trendy London journalists to trendy London journalists.
Christopher Hitchens agrees that the Eye now resembles a bitchy parish magazine for the denizens of Grub Street.
All the droppings and leavings and sort of the sweepings of the street get into the Eye in the end, and people use it also to settle scores with rivals of theirs on television programs or other newspapers or companies or even trade unions, that kind of thing. They use it as an anonymous way of getting back at each other.
Now, we naturally wanted to hear Richard Ingram's reply to the charge that Private Eye is now indistinguishable from the hoary institutions it once lampooned. Richard Ingram's, you would expect, would have a devastating rebuttal of this view ready and waiting. When we tried to contact him, the phone was answered not by Mr. Ingrams, but by Paul Foote, nephew of Michael and Britain's best-loved Trotskyite. Foote has recently returned to the Greek Street fold after being given the bombs rush from the editorship of the Socialist Worker. This champion of the people informed our disbelieving researcher, "You're not the king, you're not even a bloody courtier as far as I know, you're not important. Why should Richard Ingrams talk to you?" Leaving Mr. Foote to rant, we contacted Richard Ingrams at his country home. Yes, he would appear on the programme, but unfortunately his every waking minute was booked up for the next 2 weeks. Programme off the air by then? Terribly sorry. Never mind, perhaps he'd like to make it next series, by which time Private Eye will probably carry a little royal badge saying, "By appointment."
Terrible.
What's terrible?
Terrible nonsense, of course.
What do you mean? What are you talking about?
Hitchens is only angry because he hadn't been invited to Private Eye lunches.
Is he?
Yes, it's as simple as that. And the Hatton Man, would you let the Hatton Man into your home? I would. If that man came to my door, I certainly wouldn't let him in, entry phone or not.
There's something in what you say about Hatton, there's no question.
Yes, he is a bore. And in fact, on the Private Eye door, they do have a very large sign saying "No bores." And Hatton clearly can't read either.
I think you're being monstrous to Hatton. If the Hatton has worked for them for 3 years and received no indication that he was about to be booted, did you not think that's ill behaviour?
Yes, if you accept what Hatton says, yes.
And you don't?
No, I don't.
Right, next question.
I watched the item with fascination and alarm. Our young researchers are very dedicated and they're very good, and I think most of the facts in that are true, but they don't quite add up to the significance that our young researchers think they have, because in fact nothing more sinister is happening in Private Eye beyond the fact that the guys who run it are getting sick of it because they're getting old, and they're slowly realising, too slowly in most cases, that the role of funny boy is a hard one to grow old in. And now they're just getting interested in other things.
How does this sickness manifest
Well,
itself?
that's why Christopher Booker is writing this endless philosophy in Spectator. It's longer than Hegel's or Hugh Hefner's, you see? Because he's got a sudden urge for seriousness, and so has Ingrams. The interesting thing about Ingrams is his thirst for seriousness. He wants to be serious, and it's a hard thing to do when you're editor of Private Eye.
The ultimate thing, of course, is that it's very, very funny. And no one on these other desks would say it isn't funny. Did you see the picture of Russell Harty last week in black glasses? Opening a bookie shop in Camden Town.
But wait a second.
But wait a minute, let's just let me answer.
With mafia glasses.
The reason why I was appalled by the picture of me opening a betting shop in Camden Town was not that I earned whatever it was, 200 quid for opening a betting shop, but the fact that the picture was so awful. It made me look like a kind of slagged out mafia man.
How much did you get?
I think it's a pretty shady operation.
What, opening a betting shop?
Well,
I only do it on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Oh no, how much did you get? Come on, how much did you get? You didn't get £200.
I think I'm not going to tell you how much I got. You can put it in the duty.
Well, should we hold up a guess on a scorecard?
Is it possible to get one of
Peter.
this?
However serious or trivial the magazine may be, and however responsible or irresponsible it is, it's obviously triggered a lot of things just below all our surfaces, has it not indeed? I'm the only one who's actually coming out clean about that. You're all sniping each other during under the waves. I won't have it. I will not have it. Before we close, I have to tell you that for those people who have watched us for 12 weeks, that we tried tonight, it being our last night of this series, to get a clip of Clive James's favourite film called The Swarm, so that we could actually show you this thing in action. And the film company said, we're not allowing a piece to be released because you'll make fun of it and it upsets all the people who've made it. So we are denied that vision tonight. But his desk, God help us all, is littered with B's remains.
I should say the fact that we can't show the film is a terrific break for the audience out there, because even a few minutes of this film leaves you numb for days. You can be sick with boredom just from catching a glimpse of it. But people all over the world who've suffered because of our recommendations of this movie have bombarded me with Swarm valuables and data. For example, little Virginia Bonham Carter has sent me this very valuable bee wrapping paper, very rare, just to wrap dead bees in and to send to each other. And Belle Mooney of Viva, thank you, Belle, has sent me this extremely interesting bee tin, which you can see it's got a bee on it, and you can take the top off and you can put things like bees in that. And probably most interesting of all, Daniela of LWT Presentation Department, thank you very much, Daniela, has sent me this cream for putting on bee stings, and it is actually called Swarm. There it is. And it says here very affectingly, it just says, rub gently into the affected parts as required. And I've got 7 tubes of that, and I'll be distributing that among the audience as a bit of audience participation in a moment.
That's the Swarm wrap.
No, because I got one more tiny story. I was having lunch with an American producer called David Geiler. He's a film producer, and he told me an inside story about the Swarm which has never been released before, and you're hearing it for the first time in this program. And the main problem the makers of the Swarm faced was a hitherto unknown fact that bees crap. Now
I don't know any other way of putting it.
Noticeably.
But you can't say a bee defecates. It's not big enough to do that. But it does crap. And there's a key scene in the movie where Richard Chamberlain and Henry Fonda, you know, in his wheelchair, and a couple of other guys, Michael Caine, the scientist, they're all dressed in this. They were dressed in snow-white suits with snow-white helmets, standing in a special room, and 10,000 bees were released into the room. You see. The producers hadn't calculated on one thing, what these snow-white suits would look like after a few minutes in the same room with 10,000 bees. Because when they're afraid, they do that thing I mentioned all the time. You see, so gradually these white suits change colour to a terrible sort of... No, I won't go into it. But that scene took a long time to shoot.
It did indeed. But thank you for telling us about it, nasty though it may be. We are leaving you at a strange time, because think how empty Saturday nights will be from here on, particularly this next 2 weeks, because there's a large meeting of official prostitutes in Westminster next week, or it may be a meeting of large official prostitutes in Westminster next week. I can't really quite work out that we'd have liked to tell you about. And there's also the imminent visit of ex-President Nixon, and they'll have to go by the board. And our space on Saturday night is being filled by Michel Legrand at his piano, so you're in good company then. And I think it would be impertinent at this point, in saying goodbye to you, not to mention the support we've had from the Judith Thomas Formation dancers and the Razif cricket team, who've become very adept at making late, neat cuts, and we'd like to thank them. For the rest of you, thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
We have been asked by solicitors acting for the Thames at 6 weatherman to make an apology in the following terms, which we willingly do. Last week we referred to the Thames at 6 programme and their weatherman. The remarks I made about him were offensive to him and also untrue. We apologise for having made them.